Okay, hello everyone. Well, we came up, the four of us came up from Washington, D.C. To be here in Brooklyn, New York. And we're going to have a nice conversation today. It's going to be interesting. The goal here is not to make this a C-SPAN type panel. We want it to be a little more exciting, and we're also open to taking some questions towards the end of it. My name is Dan Spooler, Head of Industry Affairs for the Blockchain Association in Washington, D.C. Work with a lot of protocols, a lot of friends here in the audience. It's great to meet so many of you here in person finally after a couple years. I'm joined on the panel today by three experts in the Washington field. I'll let them introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and dive into some questions.
Hey, everyone. My name is Francesco Castella. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Congressman Ted Budd. I handle all his financial services, fintech, crypto needs. Before I joined the Congressman, I worked on the House Financial Services Committee, working on same issues. So happy to be here.
How y'all doing? My name is Conor Carney. I work for Congressman Lee Zeldin. I'm his legislative director and work on all the financial services issues. Prior to this, I worked for a few members of Congress and then also Senator Corker on the Senate side. So I've been on the Hill for about 6 years and mostly focused on financial services and crypto issues.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm with Alex Hilaire. I'm with the American Blockchain Initiative, and we're educating policymakers and advocating for the use of blockchain and the development of cryptocurrency here in the United States. So very excited to talk about what's going on in this space.
Thanks so much, guys. There was a poll that was recently done anonymously to some senior Hill staffers and on both sides, on the Senate and the House side. What were the priorities going to be for cryptocurrencies going into 2022? And regulations made that list. In my opinion, this wouldn't have happened a year ago, let alone 2 or 3 years ago. So to me, that's a good sign. What has changed? Why are regulations now suddenly more on the radar for these Hill staffers and the members themselves?
I think a good reason for the increase right now is, I mean, the industry has just been exploding, right? Like you look at the last year or two, especially DeFi, right? Just kind of overnight, just blowing up, and it's getting a lot of attention. But specifically, I think the thing that, I mean, we are always actively working on these issues, right? There's probably a handful of members that are actively engaged, but I think the thing that brought it to spotlight recently was probably the infrastructure bill, right? There was within that bill, there was a tax provision that essentially was meant to tax brokers or create a tax for brokers, but was written so broadly that it was going to impact almost everybody involved in the industry. And you could probably make the argument that even past that, hardware wallet providers, internet service providers, et cetera, right? So that really brought to the forefront. And you had the industry really get engaged, get active, and bring it to people's attention that this is a big issue. And I think from there, you've seen, the House Financial Services Committee had a hearing the other week. Senate Banking had a hearing on this, right? So it's at the forefront of people's minds. They know it's an issue. You have the SEC constantly in a battle with this, so it's there, it's active, and I think the industry has really pushed it to make it apparent that we need to work on this and get it right.
Well, and building off that, I think the infrastructure bill was like the first thing that brought this to like the forefront. Then you have currently the presidential working group's report that came out on stablecoins, which I think highlights that there's a jurisdictional element to the different, whether you're a securities regulator or a banking regulator, about trying to put your fingerprints on this issue. Because as it moves forward, every regulator, no matter what you're focused on, you're always focused on concentrating that jurisdiction so that your staff and that you are focused on those issues. So I think that's built upon the infrastructure issue with that report coming out, but I'm sure there's a ton of things going on.
Yeah, and I think the regulators that begun at the beginning of the Biden administration have been more active on this, as Francesco mentioned. We're triple or more we were 2 years ago as an industry in terms of our value and our size. So I think we're really starting to see kind of activation of the community in a very productive way, whether that's companies, DAOs themselves, or individuals who are hodling or participating in these public blockchain networks.
Yeah, I always like to think back in August, which is typically the slow month in Washington, D.C., it was quite the opposite this year. I think the fact that this industry got so much attention, I like to say that August of 2021 is when the cryptocurrency greater blockchain space went from being a teenager to an adult in terms of being taken seriously on Capitol Hill. The fact that we were, as an industry association, and through your help, we're able to slow down this piece of legislation was a testament to the work I think that we've all been doing, and our industry leaders. So, Conor, what are some of the issues that members take into consideration once they're introduced to cryptocurrency and blockchain for the first time?
Yeah, so I think like it's important to bifurcate it into like two different groups. You got the senators and member of Congress that are on Financial Services Committee or Ways and Means Committee or on Senate Finance and on Senate Banking, and they're those members and their staff are really in tune with what the niche issues are and what the nuanced issues are. And then you've got members off committee, whether on armed services or intel, et cetera. And members of Congress are interesting creatures in general in the sense that they've got so many things going on throughout their day that there's limited bandwidth about what they can like really drill in on, really be experts on. So they tend to focus on topics that are within the jurisdiction of the committees they're on. So, when we're talking about crypto in all of its different forms, I think, when you're talking about financial services, Ways and Means type members, they're focused on the nitty gritty of the regulation that might be coming up, how the SEC is doing this, how the CFTC might be doing this, how the banking regulators might be doing this. Whereas you've got members off committee on armed services who really the reason why they might care about the stablecoin issue would have to do more with, sanctions evasions going on abroad, or making sure that the dollar is the global reserve currency moving forward. Like the priorities of members differs depending on, what it is that they're focused on. And like I mentioned earlier, like members of Congress at the end of the day, or senators at the end of the day, need to be able to go back and explain to their constituents, like, why does this matter? Why am I spending political capital? Why am I spending this time focused on this issue? And you need to be able to explain to them in a very succinct way, like, this is why this matters, whether it's lowering frictional costs, like whether it's making sure that the U.S. is in a position moving forward, whether from a national security standpoint or just from a business competitive standpoint, to be the leader on emergence of this technology. Making that argument to someone who's in the nitty gritty on the financial regulatory side is different than those who are, don't have the time to get involved in those kind of nuanced discussions, but still care about national security or American, dominance in this field moving forward.
And many times it's the staff members, correct me if I'm wrong, that are actually the leaders on a lot of these issues within the respective office. Would you concur with that, Guy Francis?
I think like the way a typical congressional office works, like you have a host of staff and they're all assigned specific policy areas, and they're the ones that are working on these issues for the member, right? So, how I work, I focus a lot on financial services and economic issues, and I work closely with the congressman on that and kind of putting together an agenda, right? So he's leading the fight, right? He's the one who's championing these issues and that he cares about. He sees the innovation and the growth that this industry can just bring for just everyday Americans, and just kind of really just transpire what we know as traditional finance and kind of grow that and innovate that, right? So like that's what's cultivating it. So I work a lot with him to try to do that, but a lot of the meetings that we're doing with industry, it's kind of on the staff level, and then you bring it to the members and you get them involved too to kind of get their guidance on it. But I think at a direct board level of where you're working, it's the staff are kind of doing a lot of the research for it, so the members can kind of be up to speed and know what's going on. But you take the direction from the member, and we kind of try to help figure out where we can bring this issue and how to guide it and get that message across. So it's a lot of like that, just helping push that across the line.
Well, I'm going to stay on you because I want to ask this next question. Last week, the House Financial Services Committee held a hearing, which, in my opinion, and many in the space, went very well. But then this week, it was a little bit more challenging on the Senate side regarding the state of stablecoins on Capitol Hill. Can you explain to everyone, from your perspective, what was the difference between the House and the Senate side, the conversations, and why was there such a difference between the positive and the negative side on each end of Capitol Hill, and then also where we're at with this current stablecoin issue?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to the two topics, right? They were very obviously broader crypto. On the House side, going into it, the hearing was meant to be educational, right? Fact finding, getting members up to speed. That's the biggest thing that can be done right now. There's a lot of members that just really need to be right on this stuff. Education is the big thing I'm constantly pushing for people, right? When you're talking with these guys, breaking it down to simples, just making this stuff easy to digest, easy to understand. A lot of times we're, a mile wide, an inch deep on stuff because there's a lot going on. So education is a big thing on an issue like this that is relatively new compared to other stuff. But that's the House side, right? The hearing topic was very just informational, learning about it. And the witnesses were all, industry participants, right? It was the CEOs of some of the bigger companies that are actively engaged. Whereas on the Senate side, you had a mix of think tank groups and some representatives of some companies. So it was a little bit different mix of speakers that were or witnesses that were presenting, right? I also think there's just a different take from the House and the Senate on these issues, right? We're still very early on in terms of figuring out the direction the government wants to run, or at least Congress is going to run, right? There's a lot of discussions. There's some bills floating around, give or take, but I think we're still very early on in making any substantial legislative pushes. But you're always going to see different perspectives from both chambers, right? The House operates differently than the Senate, and the members operate differently and have different priorities. So the good thing is the House hearing, and even in the Senate hearing, you saw a lot of supporters of the industry, right? So there are people out there in Congress and just in DC in general that like this and want to see it grow and want to be helpful. So it's not all doom and gloom. On the stablecoins part, I think if we're looking at it, stablecoins is probably going to be the first kind of the first piece of within the entire crypto ecosystem that you see action items taken on. That's kind of the discussion right now. That's a lot of what the focus has been put on. And I think a lot of that has to do with just kind of how stablecoins operate, right? At its core, I think from a concept standpoint, it's the easiest thing in the ecosystem for members and staff to kind of wrap their heads around, because it is the closest to TriFi. So that's kind of an easy standpoint in there, right? And then you kind of go from there to CBDCs and kind of have that debate. But that's where we're starting at, and that's where we're at right now. And it's very, like I said, very early in terms of, these are our principles. This is where we want to work from. This is what we need. That's where we're at right now.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into the CBDC stablecoin discussion, but I want to get your perspective too on what happened with the Senate and the House side this week, and maybe any light you can shed on that.
I think the biggest difference, having worked on both the Senate side and the House side, and there's a lot of senators who were former members of Congress, but the things they focus on just inherently in our bicameral system are different. Whereas the Senate side, you have to think bigger picture because there's only 100 of y'all. Like it's a little bit different. Whereas when there's 435 members, you can like really drill in on the more, for lack of a better word, I'll call it populist topics. And I think that there are a lot of members of Congress where the topic of crypto and all of its forms, to members of Congress who are representing in the House of Representatives, they're a little more amenable to this topic, and they can be a little more focused on, what it is that their constituents are focused on in this space, because they have less people they're representing. And I think the biggest difference between the two, I mean, I don't want to say it's ubiquitous because you had a few members on the House side, is that I think you saw on the Senate side that there were a lot of senators very, very focused on the, decentralized element versus the traditional intermediary element of current financial regulation. I mean, as you all know, current financial regulation, whether it's KYC, AML, or any other aspect of that, is reliant upon finding that intermediary to push on as a regulator. And I think that you saw different senators, and I think you might know who I might be mentioning, that were focused more on how do we find that intermediary to press on in this current structure. And I think as we evolve thinking about this idea in Congress, whether it's on the Senate or the House side, I think a very important discussion will be, what is it we need to be focused on? Like if we want a safe system that is free of money laundering, that's something I think that anyone would agree upon. But how do you bring the old legacy regulation into congruence with a technology that's trying to completely upend that idea of intermediaries being in the middle, of having institutions in the middle, whether it be traditional legacy institutions or otherwise. So I think that was the biggest difference I saw between the two, is the House was more focused on a fact-finding mission, where I think you found some senators coming up with conclusions before having thought through the process in the first place.
So, Alex, you work with the American Blockchain Initiative, and obviously you interact with a lot of members of Congress on the House side and the Senate side. And not every one of them is passionate about financial services or financial inclusion. Some of them are, many of them are. But a lot of them are also interested in the national security component of this industry, in this space. Can you explain a little bit about what you're doing in that regard? And are you having any members of Congress take a lead on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think more awareness comes with more scrutiny, and I think when bad things happen, it can sound like we're back at 2013. Oh, it's a bunch of drug dealers, with their Bitcoin, but now we have things we can point to, kind of saying, hey, look, like this isn't worse than cash. This isn't some shadow dollar. And that we have regulations in place that do work in certain cases, and how do we expand that and have that in line with the current technology. I'd say on the national security side, in terms of the broader discussions that have gone forward in a positive manner, are blockchains kind of underlying these public blockchains. Like, what are the potential use cases? What does Web3 look like? And is America leading that? Is the kind of similar value system that we led the internet with, going to be reflected in the economies of the future? And I think that's about data, but that's also about money. And I think that's why you have legacy financial institutions threatened by it. Also, you have big tech, potentially threatened by it as well. So for DC, that gives us a bipartisan way to engage people.
So, Connor, how concerned, we have the advent right now of central bank digital currencies. How concerned are members of Congress on this development and potentially losing this global reserve status, the U.S. dollar, to a country such as China?
So, like I mentioned earlier about the difference between the bifurcation of members of Congress who are in the nitty gritty on nerding out on financial services policy, especially in this space, versus those who are not on the committees of jurisdiction. I think this is the number one issue. I think the advent of the digital yuan is the number one concern from a national security standpoint. And I think there are three different reasons. Like, if I were to pull it into three issues, I think, obviously there's the development of technology here, whether that's, jobs and companies that are bringing a tax base, and then also just like a value proposition in the first place. You have the issue of sanctions evasion moving forward, and I think there's always a legitimate conversation to have on a normative value judgment on sanctions. But one thing that is for sure is that they're not going to be effective if the U.S. financial system is not at the forefront of it. And then three, I think the biggest thing actually, like moving forward, that stable coins offer versus a CBDC from foreign nations, is that the United States, given the way we finance our budget every year with a deficit, is very reliant upon the U.S. dollar being that global reserve currency. And I think that any member of Congress or senator, no matter what party you're in, no matter what persuasion you're from, would agree upon the fact that the dollar needs to remain that sense. And the only way for that to happen moving forward, considering that there are other nations, including China, who are moving forward with CBDCs at a faster pace, is to make sure that stablecoins, the private issuers, are issuing them in the United States with U.S.-backed assets, being the reserve assets for those currencies. Because otherwise, moving forward, we're at a severe disadvantage, not just from a financing standpoint. And I think that's one issue that is really important, but just also, like I mentioned, on sanctions evasion or other issues, U.S. will lose a lot of its influence if it does not buy into the development of stablecoins backed by U.S. dollars or backed by assets that are denominated in U.S. dollars moving forward. And from a standpoint of competitiveness, it becomes pretty existential.
Yeah, and I think the digital yuan is something that China started working on much earlier than we ever had a Fed study done in our Congress on what could a CBDC potentially look like in the future if we were to decide to move forward with one. And you see now we have these dollar denominated stable coins on these public blockchain networks that are being utilized by some of the mainstream players that help modernize the payment system for credit cards and debit cards. They kind of worked together, came up with standards, and worked with regulators to make sure that it's safe and the risks are minimal and dealt with properly. I think then the digital yuan is one issue with kind of competitiveness, but then there's kind of blockchain technology being utilized with the development of more infrastructure than just pure financial, because it's kind of the moving value around, as we now know through NFTs and the tickets that you needed to get here today, that data and value can be denominated on these blockchain networks. And because of the programmability of blockchain, these networks are probably going to be the bedrock of a lot of the things that we use in our everyday lives, like the internet is today. So I think what do we want to have protected? Do we want to have our values, which in the U.S. is democracy, individual freedom, being able to vote and partake in the process. That's all there in parts of the DeFi and crypto ecosystems. And I think it's important that we embrace that and bring it into the fold and not push it away to China and other countries, such as Russia, that might not care about human rights, might not care about individual freedoms for their people or the people they want to use their digital currencies.
No, I think a lot of it is, we agree, right? Looking at how you go forward with a CBDC compared to other countries, I think we're still very early on. We're still waiting on the Federal Reserve to issue that report that we've been kind of holding our breath on. So I think not everyone's sold yet, at least in Congress, on it. Chairman Powell came out and said that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where the Fed is on this issue, Congress needs to act to even issue that. I know from my boss's perspective, and probably many of the committee Republicans' perspective, is we want to see the private market innovate on this, right? We want to see those public-private partnerships. And if there is a CBDC issued, right, and the Fed goes forward with that, you want to ensure that it's not going to push out stablecoin providers that have already, been innovating in this market for several years and are going to continue. And you want to see those continue to grow, right? But I think it comes back to some of the other things too, is looking at stablecoins that are being backed. Like the key issue for many members is ensuring that the U.S. dollar remains a reserve currency of the world. And if you are seeing these key stablecoin providers, that are choosing to be fully backed by the U.S. dollar instead of any other currency, that bodes well. That's a good thing to have. It's an additional confidence check, right? And you want to be supportive of other ways that that push that priority. So another thing that we're a long way out of, we always make the argument that the U.S. really needs to pick up the pace compared to the rest of the world on this innovation. We are, at the last hearing, I think Brian Brooks said we are unquestionably behind the rest of the world in development, or not even just development. The private sector is doing great. It's the government side in terms of creating regulations that are going to protect that innovation and allow it to grow. And honestly, I think the thing we hear all the time is you want clarity, right? You need clarity to act, right? That's what we need to do, and give that clarity that the rules of the road and can go forward and protect that. Because at the end of the day, that all kind of mixes together, and that that'll give clarity on where the government's going with CBDCs, where they're going with stable coins, what things are backed by. So that's the biggest issue.
And how close are we, do you think we are, from the United States having some type of comprehensive crypto framework? Whatever that means. By the way, it can include a variety of different verticals in this space, but we're going to get into securities probably later. I know Hester Pierce is going to be speaking, so she'll probably dive into that quite a bit, but how close are we?
No, I don't think we're close at all. for a comprehensive framework, I think we're still out. Like I said, the discussions, the significant and serious discussions, are just starting to happen now at wider levels, right? The committee here, the House and Senate banking committees are finally holding full committee hearings on these issues, right? We're finally getting there where members are digging into these issues. The regulators have been hashing this stuff out for a while now. And the reason they're hashing it out is probably what we would argue is that there needs to be some legislative clarity for, what authority do they have? The regulators are all fighting amongst themselves, trying to grab authority and trying to claim sections of the industry as their own. Probably because there is a lack of it, right? There's bills floating around there, like the Token Taxonomy Act, which has been around for a while, that Congressman Davidson is the sponsor of, that try to set clear guidelines for what's a security, what's not, and how you go about that. That's where Congress is looking at. It's like, how do you create those clarity? How do you create that clarity in the system and kind of figure it out? But we're at very basic conversations right now in Congress. It's what does the regulatory system need to look like for this? Are you creating a brand new system or a single brand new regulator that's going to monitor the space? Or do you try to shoehorn this into the existing system? Or do you kind of do a little bit of both and try to make a hybrid where you take the original system but make modifications? That's what's happening right now. Those conversations are happening. Probably going to be the middle approach. I don't think anybody wants to see a brand new regulator created for this at all. So,
I would be very surprised if that were popular.
No. So that's where we're at.
And then just building off what Francesco said, I think right now he's right that there's very little legislative impetus, but there's a lot of regulatory impetus and jurisdictional infighting, because that's the nature of any federal agency. Is they want to have the jurisdiction because then they get more staff, they have the issue, they have the security long term that they're going to be working on something that's developing. I think, like I mentioned earlier, that's why it's so important to frame this not just, and this might get into something we talk about a little bit later, not frame this not just as a financial services issue, but there are some members who care about this more from a national security issue. There are some members who are more interested in DeFi from an end use issue, whether that's companies like Filecoin or Orchid. There's a million different Helium. There are a million different examples of these companies who, members of Congress aren't necessarily focused on financial services, but if you come into their office and you explain to them, look, there are uses here that have nothing to do with, I'll admit it right now, I'm a financial services nerd. Like, that's what I'm focused on. But if you're trying to convince someone who isn't focused on those issues, you have to find what it is they're interested in. And I think you can find those things if you are to highlight them. That's the only way you're going to get them interested in the regulatory discussion and the regulatory infighting, jurisdictionally, whether it's with banking regulators or SEC regulators, because your average member of Congress just isn't super knowledgeable about the SEC because they don't serve on that committee, which is incredibly understandable. I'm not super knowledgeable about, the Department of Transportation and its inside workings, for example, because I don't work for a boss who serves on that committee. So I think that that's like one of those things moving forward, is figuring out, like, how do you get members of Congress to realize that we really can't mess this up? If we mess this up, we are putting ourselves at a disadvantage, not just from a economic competitive standpoint, but national security and, just moving forward, like a value proposition for our country. Like, anytime that there's an industry growing that can create new jobs organically, that doesn't rely upon the government, that's a very good thing that I think we can all agree upon.
Yeah, and I agree that this does all go back to U.S. competitiveness, whether we're talking about, the fiat system, trying to bridge that with a CBDC or, a digital dollar of some sort. But also what, Conor was saying about use cases and bringing that to, Washington and educating, the different committees that, might not be focused on security law, might not really, have any interest in that, as part of their day-to-day work. So, what I say to that is exactly what you were saying. We got to bring, Filecoin. We got to bring, unsolvable domains. I talked to someone from there today. These are use cases that utilize the underlying blockchain in a way that is other than just money. And I think, we're not past that yet. There are some people that don't really know that there's anything past, Bitcoin or Dogecoin. And I think, everything that's out there, this is a decentralized industry. How do we bring that together in America and have it benefit, the country? How does government utilize it if there are any ways to utilize it? And I think those are the conversations that are still a bit ways off, but we might as well kind of try to think about those issues now and look at those use cases now, so that in the future, we can move forward like we have with the internet and other technological advances.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Here we are talking at this whole conference. We're talking about NFTs. We're talking about DeFi. But the NFT component really is interesting. We met with Maxine Waters' staff not that long ago, and for any of you who don't know this, she has historically not been particularly friendly to cryptocurrency. However, we brought one of our members, Dapper Labs, fantastic work, in that NFT space, to help us, and we do that frequently. We bring great members of our association that are building great ideas and great products and services with us to meet with these members of Congress. And when we started talking about art and artists and music and how blockchain can help solve that through the use of NFTs, it was almost like a light bulb moment for many on her staff. And I think that's a good sign, because for the past 7-8 years, most of the conversations have been around cryptocurrencies, and a few years back was ICOs. But now the fastest growing verticals we're seeing from an industry association standpoint are absolutely DeFi, GameFi, NFTs, DAOs, which are extremely growing right now. Do you find when you have industry protocols and companies come to meet in your office, does it help to hear about these other use cases beyond just beyond Bitcoin and beyond crypto?
I mean, 100%, because at the end of the day, Francesco can vouch for this as well. Like, as a staffer on the Hill, the number one thing you have to explain to your boss is why they should spend time on this issue, because they have so many things going on. It's a very fast-paced environment. So, most members of Congress are incredibly intelligent people as well, but there's only a limited amount of time they can spend on each topic, because they got to bounce from topic to topic, from interview to interview, from vote to vote. That could be on any particular issue during the day. So being able to explain in a very 3-bullet fashion why they should care, why this helps their constituents, and why this helps them message on what it is they truly care about, that's what you have to be able to do. So I think moving forward, having these end use examples, and I'm going to steal a quote from Francesco here: educate, educate, educate. It is the number one thing you can do at this stage, because moving forward, I personally think in almost all areas of life, the number one reason why mistakes are made is miscommunication. I think there's a lot of miscommunication in this space because, like Alex mentioned, so many members of Congress or staffers who aren't in the nitty gritty on these issues, they hear Dogecoin or Bitcoin and think that is the entire universe that this space is. And so explaining to them that there's nuanced different products that have very little to do with each other, other than that they're completely it's complete creative destruction in the traditional legacy finance space. I think that's a very, very important element. I mean, I can even say from my personal experience, talking to Alex at Dapper Labs, it opened my eyes to what the possibilities were. And I'm someone who follows this space from a government perspective as much as I can, but actually talking one-on-one with someone who is a practitioner, you could not imagine how important that is for us in the government level, because we're so 10,000 feet, because not just the members of Congress are bouncing around, but Francesco and I are bouncing around from topic to topic, even within the financial services space, on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And a way really to hit home with certain members too is the entire crypto universe, and it's so much more than just finance, right? NFTs are a great example. Filecoin's another great example. OpenSeas, right? All this stuff. It's so much broader than that. And then we've kind of made the arguments about just looking at blockchain specifically and how those use cases can help healthcare, right? Service providers or can actually maybe even help government in terms of tracking records and doing all this stuff, right? This stuff is innovative in so much more than financial services, and finding creative ways that we can kind of expand and talk about the benefits are outside of that for certain members, and figuring out pitches that we can make to members that are off the committees and why they should be engaged and why this is important to them and this should be important to their constituents is vital. Yeah, for us and for our members that we work with on the committees, like this is, we love this stuff. We do with it a lot because it's in our wheelhouse. But I think we're always trying to figure out ways to expand it, right? Internally, I know when we're working on bills, letters, whatever it is, I always come from a perspective. My boss always comes from the perspective of we want to try to have this as broadly engaged as possible and on a bipartisan level, right? Like everything we go into, especially in the crypto world, it has to be bipartisan. We don't want this to become a partisan issue. It isn't right now. It's more of a generational issue. But you find those catches for people, like what really gets them going, what gets them motivated, what's good for them and their constituents and what they care about back home. Because at the end of the day, we have to justify what we're doing because we have to bring it back home to the constituents and be like, this is what we're working on. This is what we're doing. This is how we're making your life better. So finding those little different caveats to kind of build upon it is part of it. So when we meet with industry and we learn about the different projects and the different protocols that are out there and kind of how they're changing the lives of just everyday Americans, like that's great. I love that stuff. Whenever I can bring an anecdote back and like explain how someone who's maybe who's kind of gone the most of their adult life not being able to have access to the financial services market can now get involved and grow savings, or has a potential and has an ability to build yield because of what crypto is doing and what DeFi is doing. That's a great case right there. Yeah, so we love looking at stuff like that.
No, I mean, I guess I think it's about access and it's also about U.S. competitiveness. And I think they're related. I think it's we want to have it be a good place to run the business side of crypto and the products built alongside blockchains. But I think it also, we need to kind of bring ourselves into the fold in different ways. I'm not hoping that, there's all this regulation tomorrow. But I do think it's important that we engage in a meaningful way. It's, whatever you think of government, the crypto has a wide range of views within it on what the role of government is in monetary systems and technology. And I think, these are questions that we have to ask seriously to the industry and as a government, and making sure that, the right information makes it to the right people, given the stakes and given kind of what this technology is going to supplant, which is, the financial systems that be and, tech platforms and other things that are threatened.
There's a lot of companies, protocols, and organizations that are now actually just not doing business in the United States anymore because of a lack of clarity, a lack of uncertainty, fears of enforcement actions. And the SEC, obviously, for the past, for quite a while, honestly, it seems like they've been governed by enforcement actions because of a lack of clarity. But the buck still stops with Congress. And I think that's the best part, is that they're still elected by the voters. But right now, what seems to be happening is that a lot of these regulatory agencies are going about themselves, really, because of the lack of comprehensive framework coming from Capitol Hill. Does it help from a constituent standpoint to speak with members of Congress, whether it's in their district or not, and to tell them what are my pain points, what are my challenges, what can we do as an industry, as a private enterprise, what we can do to help make this easier for these decision makers? And in other words, do you like when organizations come and speak to you and members of Congress? Does that help? Does that make a difference?
I mean, I think 100%, because just hitting on what I said earlier, like, members of Congress have to be able to explain or think through very quickly, like, why they should spend time on this and why they should spend political capital. Like, whether it's like a traditional industry that's like, blue collar, like, like union type industry or finance or crypto, like, what they care about is how many of their constituents are going to benefit either from a literal standpoint of like jobs in the district, or from a less direct standpoint of like, how is this going to lower costs for them? I think talking about how DeFi can lower frictional costs is such a huge thing to talk about with these members of Congress, because like, whatever transactional costs that their constituents are dealing with, especially in today's world where we have some transitory price increases, you have that situation where like any way you can lower costs is a very, very important thing to hit on. So that I think yes.
See, that to me is interesting to hear, that for folks to come and actually say what the solutions they're solving.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more because they, at the end of the day, and I sound like a broken record at this point, like members of Congress really need to be able to very succinctly and simply explain why they're spending their time on a certain issue, because they only have a certain amount of time in a given day to focus on topics. So they have to choose them wisely. And so those that they can message on, hey, like, this is going to help you either from a standpoint of create jobs in our district and make our community stronger, or lower frictional costs and transactional costs, whether it's that too. It's a big help in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the more information we have and decision makers have, the better it is. I mean, a big part of our job is research, right? We are constantly trying to get more information on the topics that we're dealing with and discussing, right? Because we have to build arguments for that, and we want to also ensure that our bosses are as best prepared as they possibly can be to make decisions and to put forward meaningful legislation that can change. So hearing from constituents about how this stuff is changing their lives or making their lives easier, or hearing from different projects about what they're doing and the specific problems that they're trying to address and change is good for us, right? Because there's so much stuff going on. There's so much stuff out there, especially in this ecosystem, that if you can nail it down for us and just break it down so we know what's happening and where to look, that's always helpful for me. I mean, on a personal level, I love this stuff. I'm deeply involved. I like to research and read about it. Reading white papers, like this stuff is like what I like. And it's great that I can transfer it over into my work life as well, because it's a big issue that my boss really cares about. But there is so much out there. And this, especially within crypto and DeFi specifically, it's just overnight. There's just so much happening and so much changing. So when people are coming in talking to us and kind of just telling us what they're doing and how they're going out there and solving real world problems, making transfers of funds instantaneous, right? Settlements happening instantaneous, or if you're trying to send money back to your family outside the US, and how remittances, like how we're just, taking things that have been around, and just making them work better. Like these are all great use cases, right? So I love going to my boss and basically trying to explain to him, like, this is what's happening. Like, this is great. And this is why it's good for the people back home that can really utilize it, because the more of that, the more ammo I have in terms of that information, it's easier just to make our job, right? It's easier for him to make decisions about this stuff. So I like it when people come in and talk to us, or you just want to chat. I mean, I welcome it. With constituents, if you want to call up and just call your members about, how this stuff is revolutionary, like, that's great. I really, really hope people start doing that a lot more. I mean, even Twitter, right? We saw Twitter, crypto Twitter is crazy and it's so active. And we saw it really popping off during the infrastructure fight. And that was, really, I got a lot of attention because members are on Twitter. They're very active. They're paying attention. So, utilize any way you can to get in touch with your congressmen and your senators and make them realize how important this issue is, and make them also realize that we have to get it right and we got to allow innovation to prosper.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, like, crypto can call up, everyday people that use this across the country, across the world. Here in America, when we're talking about this, there are people who will call their Congress people and put it on the map for them. Wall Street, I don't think, has that kind of, broad constituent support where they're going to call. And I don't know if you guys got a lot of calls from people like asking their banks not to be regulated. But I think, we have a benefit of being decentralized and of being inclusive. And I think we need to make sure we're bringing that to Washington.
And it's still so early in the grand scheme of things. You just mentioned, nobody's going to be calling up demanding their bank stops being regulated. But this whole space right now, it's still in its infancy, all things considered. And I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be pretty consequential over how. And we're developing this as we speak, almost in real time. And so I guess the old adage works: call your congressman or tweet your congressman. Maybe that's the new thing. It works. It works. It makes a difference. So I wanted to try and take some questions from the audience. I know we're kind of wrapping it up though towards the end, but if anybody has a couple, we could probably take one or two before. What about back there, back row? That's right. Yeah. Yeah, DYDX, they're a member of the Blockchain Association, but as you pointed out, they geo-blocked their U.S. customers because they just don't want to work. It's just too uncertain at this point in time. That's a great example.
Yeah, going off of that, we're spot on, right? My boss is constantly harping on the fact that we really need to get up on this, or we're going to be left behind. Crypto, it's here to stay. We're not going anywhere, and it drives me personally nuts when I see the U.S. on lists with Iran, North Korea, all these other like heavily sanctioned countries, because we can't get our regulations straight, and we can't implement clarity for the industry. That's insane when you look at it from a perspective of where we've been as a country, right? We've always been being huge proponents of financial growth and freedom and economic prosperity. Why has that changed for this?
So it's a tax question. That's what it boils down to. Yeah, we didn't even get to taxes today. We could do another hour on that. What do you think? I mean, whatever you can comment on, obviously. You know.
It's being, I think it's one of those I think taxes in this is probably it's probably been the first thing we have really addressed. So it's constantly kind of being brought up. I know there is, in terms of, I want to say there was some rules around wash sales in crypto, and kind of changing that to make it more akin to how security wash sales apply. I know short-term and long-term sales. The other debate too, and we had a conversation earlier, it's just like, if you're transferring crypto from one wallet to another, or like putting it into a DeFi protocol and yield farming that way, how many taxable events have happened in that entire process, right? And then you're cashing out to something else. Those are all questions we're constantly having to have. The IRS is very, very engaged because they have an incentive to be very engaged. They're probably, out of all the regulators, they're probably the most advanced in terms of figuring this out. And because there's a tax incentive. I mean, we keep going back to this infrastructure bill. It was all about taxes. It was all about generating revenue to pay for whatever was in that bill. So, yeah.
And just building upon that, I mean, this is not a value judgment on federal agencies, no matter how they're structured, but inherently a federal agency is always going to try and increase its jurisdiction and influence. That's just the nature of the beast in Washington, D.C. And so I think, when Francesco talks about the incentive with the IRS, like, there's a clear incentive for there to be a broad interpretation of that section of the infrastructure bill, for example. So, like, I do think that, when we talk about how many taxable events, like, this is where reaching out to your members of Congress is really, really important, because how are they going to know what issues to push on when, whether they're on Ways and Means or Financial Services, when different representatives from those agencies come in, like, those members of Congress need to know, like, what are my constituents actually thinking about when it comes to this? And I think, the tax issue is probably at the forefront. And, like I said, I don't think the IRS is any different than any other federal agency. There is always an incentive to increase influence and increase jurisdiction. So finding ways to press on lawmakers to explain to them, like, this is where we need some updates to the law for clarification to make sure that these are clear. What are these taxable events? Like, that's extremely important, I think, moving forward, because if you can leave it broad, then the federal agencies will interpret it broadly.
So we have to wrap it up, unfortunately, but I want to just say that this is the first DeFicon we participated in. We certainly hope there's more. I think we can do a whole other panel discussion on some specific regulatory issues, including securities, taxes, commodities, trading. So I think we're going to be here for the rest of the afternoon and tomorrow. Let us know if you have any further questions offline. But I just want to thank everybody in the audience too for just hearing us out and being nice to us from Washington, D.C. And we're going to continue to work with you closely. And thank you again. Appreciate it.